Right, ladies and gentlemen, we will start the lecture, and we will begin with the first slide, if I can know how to work this properly. And we're looking at a building which we're going back slightly in time to where we were yesterday. It's got a rather sort of difficult name, the Charnley Persky House. It's on the North Shore. It's a very smart suburb, and it's a sort of very eclectic series of architecture on the North Shore. And this stands out very clearly as the most extraordinary building of its type. It's by Adler and Sullivan again, during the period when Frank Lloyd Wright was working for them. And the reason for the funny name is that Mr. Charnley built it. Mr. Charnley was a wealthy timber merchant, and then, like all these buildings I'm talking about, it went through many ownerships in the last 120, 30 years. And at one stage, in fact, they added onto the building at the end there where the tree is, which would completely and totally destroyed the balance. But then the house was purchased by a man called Persky, Seymour Persky, and he was a great benefactor who gave the house on its acquisition to the Society of Architectural Historians in Chicago. Quite some gift. So here we see the Charnley Persky house. It is very simple, it's very plain, it has a bit of decoration, which is again very Sullivan-esque, but it's totally symmetrical, form following function, the central doorway leading to a room on each side, the central stairwell, light well we shall see in a moment, and here again just the little touch, a little flourish of a Tuscan loggia on the first floor, with a rather nice decoration of the ornament there, sort of Sullivan-esque, Lloyd Wright-esque as well. Very pretty little decoration, probably by Frank Lloyd Wright. So it's got a very plain, simple, unadorned quality about it, and here we can see the symmetry of the building. As you can see there from the plan, they added on another bay there, which would have been quite disastrous, and it's been taken away now. But you can see that in the centre there's the light well with a living room on the one side and dining room on the other, two bedrooms again symmetrically placed above. It's unfortunate, being owned by the Society of Architectural Historians, you can actually go and visit it. I don't think you can just pitch up. I think you have to make an appointment to get in, but of course they'd be really too happy to welcome you if you phoned up beforehand. And here again we can see the light well in the middle. It's this clear, plain, unadorned quality about it. The spindles are very interesting. This sort of spindle screen here, which of course is very much a motif of Frank Lloyd Wright. I imagine that this would have been probably a contribution by him. This use of these very thin little strips of wood, which he uses in his chairs, of course, here using it to great effect as a screen on the first floor of the house. So it's got that sort of early feeling of modernity in what, of course, then was a very eclectic world, just at the time, in fact, interestingly, of the Chicago Fair, the great expo we saw yesterday, which was a total variance to this simplicity which Sullivan was so keen to perpetuate. So we'll go on to, from there, looking at this building as a very one-off example of the early modernity in Chicago, to Frank Lloyd Wright. And in what is one of his many books, as I think I mentioned, he writes a good 20-plus books during his career, and one is called An Autobiography. It's not actually the usual sort of, went to high school and I did so-and-so and I knew so-and-so. It's a rather sort of rambling book about his ideas and his theories and so on, as well as his life. But he, at one stage, and I obviously have just taken the gist of it, he says to build his new house, his new theme, is to get rid of the attic and the dormer. Get rid of the unwholesome basement. Instead of chimneys bristling everywhere, I can see necessity for only one or at most two. So the integral fireplace becomes an important part of the building itself. Instead of cutting up the interior into boxes, into boxes, I declare the whole lower floor as one room, cutting off the kitchen as a laboratory. So the lady of the household works at her Bunsen burner, you see. Out of sight, out of mind. But those are sort of a lot of his principles in a nutshell. And then, of course, these are applied very clearly to his prairie houses. His prairie houses, which, if you remember, just to remind you for those who weren't here yesterday, the prairie house has nothing to do with the prairie as such. But he looks upon the prairie, which of course is the whole essence of the Midwest, as the starting point for these houses, which are horizontal, which are meant to align with the landscape, which are not meant to offend the landscape in any way. And you have these very strong horizontality with these low-lying pitched roofs. Giving shelter and shade. This is the Frank Thomas house, and it's an example of his mature prairie style. As usual, the archway there makes you believe that it's an entrance into the house, which it isn't. You actually have to go through that archway to climb up a staircase to get into the house. And also, rather sort of fascinatingly, you can see the small plot with the next door neighbour there on the right, completely fighting with each other. These two houses are completely different styles, built at exactly the same period. The house peering in on the right is obviously this Queen Anne, so-called Queen Anne style of Chicago architecture. But one of the best examples of this era here now in the early 1900s is the Hertley House. All these buildings in Oak Park, but there are others in other suburbs as well. The Arthur B. Hertley House in Oak Park. It has a wonderful sense of the texture of the stone and the brickwork. It has, again, this big overhanging roof, rather like a tree. You see, the whole thing goes back to early man, where you shelter in your cave, round your far in the centre, or you shelter in your hut with the overhanging roofs or overhanging trees giving you shelter and security. It's got this sense of all these early primitive feelings to it. The band of windows running all along the first floor. Again, this horizontality emphasized so clearly, with the entrance actually sort of hidden behind the brick wall there. You can see the semicircular arch of the entrance to the house itself. There are wonderful use. You look at in the detail here, the use of the brick and the stone to give this textured patterning, simple ideas made so very complex and very interesting in this structure here. And the house itself has an interesting history because in the 1920s it was purchased by Frank Lloyd Wright's sister, and she with her husband lived here. They in fact extended the house, which I presume was with her brother's agreement or not, I'm not sure, but perhaps she was as tough as he was. But in any case, they lived in it for 26 years, but then the present owners, who purchased the house in the 1990s, brought back the house to its original glory. And you can see here the interior, where this is obviously a reconstruction because it would have gone through various owners, but it's brought back to what it was originally. Here again, you've got the stained glass window in the ceiling there, the top lighting, the chairs with their spindle backs, the whole idea, and this wonderful fireplace at the end there, with that great use of the brick and the stone to give this texture and complexity to the interior. Here, the Hertley House, where it shows, here you can see again that you have the big overhanging roof, you have the central chimney, you have the geometric shapes, you have the square columns, the circular arch, semicircular arch. You have the use of earth colours, all these aspects which are so clearly part and parcel of what he thinks of as the house for the prairies, a house that will blend in with the contours of the land, which it does, and which it shows so clearly here with the green lawn and the trees and so on. It's a wonderful building that is here in Oak Park. Now, these buildings are all privately owned, You can pass them, you can look at them, because there are no fences and there are no walls and gates to shield the public from them, but you can't generally go into them. I'm sure if you lived in Chicago, there'd be a day or perhaps a couple of days in the year when they'd be open to the public for sort of charitable purposes, but generally they're not open to the public. And on that score, just to thinking about his houses, he designed, and which I mean he fully designed, a complete set of plans, over 1,000 buildings. And of those, 523 were built. And of those 523, about 400 plus survive today. Nowadays, there is actually one for sale at the moment. They're quite reasonable prices. I think basically the price reflects the fact that you're inheriting the most enormous millstone, basically, that you'll have to restore it to its former glory. You'll have a great deal of responsibilities regarding the house. But there are still, as I say, over 400 surviving in America. There are, with one or two few exceptions, all those 400 plus are in America, in 38 different states. And that's also just to make the point that I'm not showing the houses in California simply because I've never visited them, but there are quite a range of very lovely Frank Lloyd Wright houses in California, apart from many of the other southern states as well. Now, moving on from the Hertley House to what is his most famous Prairie building. It's called one of the great iconic buildings of the 20th century. It is in a separate suburb called Hyde Park, which is actually the district of the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago is a huge institution. It's a very, very significant institution. It's one of the big top universities in the whole of the United States. And it was built, the house was built here on a small plot of land, as usual. The plot wasn't too big. And it's now right in the middle of the university complex. So obviously it's a wonderful addition to the various other buildings the university has, all in different styles. But here, the Roby House, the Frederick Roby House, is slightly at variance to what we've seen before in that you don't now have the hipped roof. You have simple horizontal lines, and that is it. You have these great horizontal beams running across the floors. In addition, you have here this great stack, this great sense of the building rising through actually what is three different floors. There's the ground level, the first level, and the bedroom level up above. You've got this strong, strong horizontality. You've got the wonderful Roman brickwork and the stonework. You've got in the foreground, of course, almost a symbol of his work, which is the urn there, the square, the cross, and the circle. And the Roby House is today owned by the university. It is open to the public. It is still under restoration. They haven't yet opened, they haven't yet restored the top floor. And like all these buildings, you cannot just wander through them. You have to go on a guided tour. But you would be able to do this on a daily basis virtually. Now, that is the man who built the house. He looks quite a distinguished young bloke. And there he is, 1910. He commissions Frank Lloyd Wright to build a house for himself and his new bride. Sadly, it's a very sad story, this. Sadly, the next year, after the house was finished, his father died and left enormous debts. And so he had to sell the house to honorably pay the debts of his father. They were supposedly a wealthy family. They had a bicycle and motorcycle manufacturing works, but the father obviously squandered the money, and so poor Mr. Roby had to. But nevertheless, the house remains called after him. If you buy a Frank Lloyd Wright house, you can't call it the Edward Saunders house or whatever. You've got to call it by the name of the original builder and live with it forever after. Now, in 1911, when it's sold, it's bought by a man called Taylor, who then promptly also dies very quickly after that, and so his widow sells it, and then the family of Wilbur, Marshall D. Wilbur, owned the house for some years, and which is very valuable because the Wilbur family, living there from 1911 to 1926, took lots of photographs, and there are a lot of photographs of the family in the house, using and living in it for really the first time. In 1926, the Roby House was bought by the Chicago Theological Society, who then, in 1957, announced that they're going to demolish the house. Even then, because the 1950s is hardly the most sensitive decade of the last century, even then there were huge protests, and so a man called William Zeckendorf comes to the fore and buys the house and promptly donates it to the University of Chicago. And it's now run by the Frank Lloyd Trust. So a big boo to the Theological Society and a round of applause to Mr. Zeckendorf. But the house survives as really the most famous of this building, not the most famous building by Frank Lloyd Wright, but the most famous of the Prairie Houses. And this is fun to look at, really, because this is taken from the corner site. There's a road on each side now. You can, when you look at the building, you've seen that wall there with the lovely brickwork. It continues through to here. So where is the entrance? I mean, there is actually no entrance. And typical Frank Lloyd Wright, then you've got to go grope your way down a little dark alleyway to get to a little insignificant door, which is the entrance to the house. It was a slight phobia, I think, on his part, or a slight foible anyway. Anyway, once you do find the way into the house, you can see that you enter into what is the lobby, and the carpet, of course, would be a copy of the original. The original, you can see, designed in rather a nice modern manner, designed by a man called Niederken. Now, the door, which you can see on the right-hand side there, leads through into what was intended as a billiard room come a children's playroom. And when I was there last year, the room was actually entirely covered with sort of building materials and so on and so forth, because it was still under reconstruction. This is the cloakroom here. And what you see particularly is one of his very distinctive quirks was to have this sense of certain rooms compressing, pushing down upon you. This is a sense of compression, so that you feel as you enter in here that you want to get out of it because it's rather low down, or the roof is quite low, and so then you make your way up the staircase, you see, to get to the release. Compression and release is what it's called. But the ceilings are sometimes very low, but people say that Frank Lloyd Wright actually didn't realize how low they were because he was a very short man. He actually claimed on his passport to be 5 foot 8.5 inches, which is totally untrue. He was about 5 foot 6 inches, but he refused to acknowledge the fact that he was shorter than his wife, who was 5 foot 8.5. He was very conscious of being so short, and there is a lovely story. There are masses and masses and masses of stories about Frank Lloyd Wright. And later on, when he had his fellowship, when he had people studying under him called his fellowship, which I'll just mention tomorrow, one of these chaps was a big, tall fellow, shall we call him Charlie? And Charlie was standing there, 6 foot 6, and he said at one stage to Charlie, "Charlie, please sit down, you're ruining my design." It was... But there you see, this is it. So you get in here. Obviously, you don't linger in an entrance lobby. You either go and play billiards or you go up the stairs to be received by your host. So you leave your coats behind, you rise up the stairs, and this is the compression, and then you enter the room above, and it's the release of this great, great room that you enter. With the light-filled environment. You see, you don't need curtains in a room like this because you have the stained glass windows throughout the first floor. And there you've got the sort of lighting similar in feeling, similar in feeling to the lights we saw yesterday in the Rookery in Chicago. Now, if you look at the end there, there's a bit of greenery, there's a couple of plants. And it's worth mentioning that actually these buildings are so revolutionary, these buildings are so exciting, these buildings are so different, but Frank Lloyd Wright's was limited in the fact that he didn't actually have much interest in gardening itself. Even when he builds big houses, his gardens are really not a significant feature in his makeup. But I think, therefore, in this building itself, you couldn't have a garden as such. But on this first floor level, there's quite a big balcony here, where obviously you could have a lot of wonderful urns and pot plants and things. Similarly, as that doorway there leads to the porch, where you could also, if you wanted to, have a greenery. But Frank Lloyd Wright himself was not a gardener under any circumstance. So here you're looking at the living room, and here you can just briefly see a plan. You rise up the staircase here, then you walk into this big space, the living room, the alcove there, the porch beyond, the balcony, and then from the living room you go into the dining room, and then the kitchen. And it says guest, but I think that was probably just a sort of spare room of sorts. That's a sort of guest loo there. And then the upper floor, which I have never seen, it contains three bedrooms and bathrooms. So here again we move looking down from the living room to the dining room. This wonderful space with, of course, in the middle is the hearth, is the fireplace. And again, this very modern feeling to the light fittings of the ceiling. The stained glass window you can see making patterns on the floor there. All these designs, of course, by Frank Lloyd Wright. And then from there you lead into the dining room. This is an original photograph where the table is fixed, the standard lamp is fixed, and then the chairs, showing again his these high-backed, spindle-backed chairs. In this instance, some of those chairs survive, but they don't survive in the Roby House, unfortunately. They survive in another museum in Greater Chicago. And but the house now has these chairs remade, so they look the same. So it's the same feeling to it. And here, again, we can see this is a photograph taken from the internet. It's an architectural digest photograph, where obviously when this photograph was taken, the table hadn't yet been replaced. That's obviously just a temporary table there. From there you go into the dining room alcove at the end, and here you can see the alcove, which is obviously intended to have a table in it, and then a detail I took in June of the top left, which is the stained glass window of this room. And again, looking back, looking towards the Roby House, these wonderful, strong, huge beams stretching out, giving shelter, giving coolness, giving a sense of ornamentation to the interior as well. And there again, you've got the brickwork and the stonework. It has a simplicity about it. And I quote again from some writer saying one of the world's most famous buildings. Certainly his most famous Prairie House. But at the same time, well, in fact, just a year before, but at the same period, he is also designing or builds a Unitarian church, which is called the Unity Temple. The Unitarian Church was the church of his forebears. He himself, as I think I mentioned yesterday, was not actually a church goer, but he was brought up in the Unitarian faith. So he would have been very aware of it. Now, there was a church on this site, a Unitarian church on this site. I think it was a sort of neo-Gothic building, which was unsuitable for the church's purposes. And they employ Frank Lloyd Wright in, as you see, 1905 to 1909 to rebuild their meeting house and place of worship. The meeting house is on the right-hand side, and the place of worship is on the left. It's separated by an entrance, which we'll go through in a minute. Now, it's on a corner site again. It's on a very busy corner site. if you go up to the left there, you come to a big street, the main street, in fact, of Oak Park, down which, at the time, went streetcars going clatter, 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 and then also went trains going through it as well. So there would be an enormous amount of hooting and shouting and screaming and banging and crashing of these various means of transport. Today, in fact, this is a photograph taken from the internet because I loathe cars in my photograph, and you couldn't but not take photographs. They were all banked up here today, but somehow this photograph avoids them. Now, this Unity Temple is regarded as one of his best works of architecture. In the first instance, it's the first public building in America to be built entirely out of one material, which is concrete. It's not the first in the world, but it's a very, very early contender for it. There were concrete buildings being built in France a little earlier, but this is the first time a public building has been built entirely out of concrete. Why? Because, of course, again, modern materials always attract him. Anything which is modern was very exciting in his mind. And it also is so sensible because now you can try and block out the noise of the street and the trams and the trains. And so what you have is no windows around the building. You have clerestory windows up above, but basically, as we'll see in a moment, the temple is actually top lit. You now enter up the staircase here to the porch that leads you into the building, and then you can see there you are, for the worship of God and the service of man is carved above the entrance. You enter there, and if you turned right, you would go into the sort of meeting house. If you turn left, you go into the place of worship. And here is the ground plan where you enter through those doorways there, the doorway we've just seen. And then what you see here is a square within another square. It's the perfect symmetry. In fact, the central square is a cube. And the spatial perfection of it is just palpable. You can actually feel it when you stand in it. And it's very similar. Look, it's not original. It's not totally original because the Florentine Renaissance created wonderful spatial forms out of squares and semicircles. But this is again introducing that to the Unity Temple here. It says, for some reason, cloisters, but take no notice of that. These are balconies. These are 3 balconies overlooking the central space. The pulpit, of course, is the focus of attention, and so everybody has a completely uninterrupted view of the pulpit. There are also benches within the central area itself as well. So here, let's just look inside. Here, you're looking towards the pulpit. And first of all, we consider the roofing. There you've got this grid-shaped pattern of the beams, creating a sort of checkerboard framework within which are stained glass windows to filter the light through into the church. And then these big sort of piers here. There we are. Don't know what's... These piers... sorry, we'll use it here. These piers are obviously the load-bearing element in the building. They support the balconies above, they support the roof on top. And here you can see the roof, which allows in the light. And I love the way he talks about the fact that the lighting from the roof gives the impression of a happy, cloudless day. And there the light is pouring down into this wonderful, perfect cubic space below. You can see the benches. You can see the benches up here. Well, the seats. You look down onto the service, and you can see the lighting again, which has this lovely sort of modern, simple touch about it. And here again, you can see the interior space in its entirety. It was the most extraordinary thing that I visited there on the 17th of June last year, 17th of June 1917. And the guide we had with us said, well, don't think we'll ever get into the Unity Temple, you know. It's been under reconstruction for the last 3 or 4 years. Nobody's been allowed in at all. But it is opening today for the first time. So we said, well, let's go and have a look. He said, there'll be lots of queues. We won't be able to get in. There were no queues at all, and we got in. You can see that there was nobody there. I mean, it was absolutely wonderful. It was quite extraordinary. It was so fascinating. Wonderful place to be. It was a very, very, very inspiring that it has this solidity, it has this bulk, this sort of strength about it. And it isn't all wispy and just sort of airy-fairy. This big strength, this power, this simple cubic simplicity, this perfect shape that you have. And then, of course, as he says, this lovely light filtering through, which is a happy, cloudless day. So it is a huge, huge success, the Unity Temple. And as I say, it is regarded as one of his most imaginative and one of his most successful works. And there's just a drawing, again, of the function of the temple, of course, is the place of worship, and then on the right-hand side, there's no sort of spatial concept there. It's just a long room in which obviously you have your teas and coffees or whatever Unitarians drink. And they're on one on each side. Now, what happens is quite extraordinary, that this building, this is finished by the time the Roby House is under construction. So these are two of his biggest and most important works up to this point. And one ends in 1909. The Roby House will be finished only in 1910. But in 1909, the first phase of his life ends. A huge a huge change suddenly takes place. And entirely of his own making, which is understandable. What happens is that in 1909, in the autumn of 1909, Frank Lloyd Wright closes his Oak Park studio and sails for Europe in the company with a lady called Mamah Cheney. Mamah Bothwick Cheney. Bothwick was her maiden name and Cheney was her married name. And it's pronounced Mamah, M-A-M-A-H. And she was the wife of one of his Oak Park clients, and they both leave on a liner from New York in 1909, leaving their spouses and their children behind them. And imagine, it's 1909. I mean, this is before the First World War. He came from the Unitarian Church. I mean, it is inconceivable that anyone could do that at the time. You can imagine the shock, the horror, it's sort of incomprehension that anyone, but only Frank Lloyd Wright would do that. I mean, he just decided that he'd had enough of his wife, who bored him rigid, and here she was going off with somebody who actually fascinated him intensely. So that was it. And the reason for going to Europe, well, I mean, partly was to flee, I suppose to escape. I suppose a better word. What drew Wright to Europe, though, was that he had this chance to publish his works up until this moment. There'd been an offer from a German publisher called Ernst Wasmuth. So they set off for Europe, they go straight to Berlin, and then actually spend the better part of 2 years in Europe. He supervising his work, his publication. She was a very confirmed feminist, and she was translating the works from Swedish into English of a feminist writer from Stockholm, or from Sweden. And so they were sort of working at the same time. They lived in Florence for a period of time, and then eventually will return to Europe in 1911, to America in 1911. Never returning back to their spouses, never. That was the end of his first phase. And so what is interesting, this is a sort of caesura. Therefore, his Prairie House stops, not necessarily because he didn't want to continue it, not necessarily because he wasn't going to get any work now. He was in Europe for 2 years. And in addition, he changes direction completely. And what he does on return, there's the Wasmuth portfolio first of all. It's in 2 volumes, and it contains the plans and perspectives of the buildings up from 1893 to 1909. And I pop in just a little work, illustration at the bottom there of what was the Avery Coonley House. The Avery Coonley House was in Greater Chicago. It was in a suburb called Riverside. It was outside Chicago, but it wasn't far away from Chicago. And I use it as an example because you can see from the illustration that it was a very big room that was being shown here. And the Coonleys were an extraordinarily rich couple. They both were great heirs of fortunes independently. And so they're built not, so for the Coonleys, Frank Lloyd Wright builds not a small house on a small, well, not a large house on a small plot, he builds a very big house on an enormous acreage. And so everything is the Coonley house is the prairie style writ large, and there's sort of corridors and wings and so on and so forth. So it is interesting that you can enlarge, you can actually adapt the Prairie House to various purposes. But when he returns with Mamah, and he persuades his mother, who was of Lloyd Jones, as I say, who came from Wisconsin, to acquire some land for him nearby to the Lloyd Jones territory. It's in Spring Green, Wisconsin, and it is southern Wisconsin. And this is the house he builds for the two of them. The house itself is the part on the right-hand side. The wing here to the left is a sort of ancillary wing, which was for sort of the workshops and sort of modest accommodation for people and so on. It was an adjunct to the house, really. And in addition, in the wing on the left was his garage. His garage for all his huge, magnificent open-top cars that he bought all the time, without any money to pay for them. He was called Slow Pay Frank, generally. So the house itself is for himself and his new lady in his life, Mamah. And they'll live here. The house is built in 1911. And again, of course, it's got the same horizontality about it, but it no longer sort of fits into the plan we've seen of his earlier buildings. Then he will live here from 1912 to 1913 with Mamah. And then in 1914, when he has a big commission designing the buildings for what was called the Midway Garden, which was in Chicago, and it was one of these, rather like the Tivoli in Copenhagen, rather like in the old 18th century, the Vauxhall Gardens in London, where people would go to these gardens to sort of wander around, listen to music, have a drink, have something to eat, and so on. So it was a sort of place of entertainment, and he had this big commission to design the buildings for that. So he was away in September 1914 when complete, total, utter disaster struck. What happens is that in September 1914, while Wright was away overseeing the construction of Midway Gardens, Mamah fired a Taliesin servant. Oh, by the way, his house is called Taliesin. I'll go back one. I can't move the thing. The house is called Taliesin. Taliesin is a Welsh name, and it means rising brow or shining brow. And the house is built on the brow of a hill. Taliesin was a very early, mainly mythological figure in the Welsh literature. He was a sort of bard and a writer and a whatever, but it's rather like the Arthurian legends. He's not necessarily a real figure. And Taliesin, therefore, is named after this bard from this Welsh tradition. So Mamah fires a Taliesin servant, 30-year-old Julian Carlton from Barbados. As a demented form of retaliation, Carlton locks all the doors and then sets fire to Taliesin. As those inside tried to escape through the windows, Carlton waited outside for them with an axe and murders 7 of the people inside, including Mamah and her 2 children. Carlton was then found having drunk muriatic acid and dies 7 weeks later. Can you imagine what he must have felt like? Imagine returning on that long, arduous train journey all the way back from Chicago, probably took him a good 12 hours, knowing that he's going to face the most terrible, terrible tragedy that anybody could have had. There's this woman that he ran away with, this person who he absolutely worshipped, who he regarded as a complete soulmate in his life, who he just did everything for, he had built Taliesin for her, and then now she's murdered with her 2 children by this crazed individual. It's terribly, terribly sad. It's thought that the man standing there, the house, this must be a very photograph. It looks as if there's still smoke billowing from it. I don't think if there is, but the chap standing there is thought to be Frank Lloyd Wright. And he writes in his autobiography that, of course, he was absolutely, completely dumbfounded. He was shattered. His whole life completely was turned upside down. But you know, most of us, I would have thought, who were suffering such the most terrible, terrible tragedy, would have sort of given in. I mean, you'd have escaped to the Antarctic, or you'd have, done whatever, something to just run away from it all. And it's only his strength of character that he pulled himself together after a time of dreadful mourning, but he very shortly afterwards decided simply to rebuild Taliesin. And he rebuilds the house. Really as a memorial to her. But it was the most terrible, terrible thing to happen. And of course, it therefore stops everything dead in its tracks. What happens now is that you see Taliesin 3, because Taliesin 1 was the house he built for his mistress Maima. Taliesin 2 is built after a fire. There was a second fire, but that was an electrical fire. It wasn't a sort of cataclysmic disaster. There was a second fire in 1925. So what you see today is Taliesin 3. It's been the same house rebuilt twice, and now you see the third version. Now, on a beautiful day, you are taken round the grounds. You can go for a short tour if you want to, but really if you go to Taliesin, and it's all guided tours again, you can't wander around on your own, but you should go on the long tour. So you start off in a building which was originally built by Frank Lloyd Wright as a school on the land. The land of Taliesin, it numbers about 800 acres, and there was a school on the land, which was then made into later the architectural complex for his students, his fellows. We started off there with a lecture, and then what we did was walk quite substantially. I mean, it wasn't just a little amble. We walked quite a lot through the meandering countryside. So you walked through this beautiful landscape. So you could walk down from the left to the right. You turned round corners, through trees, through clumps of woodland, and then you walked through the path leading towards a lake. And it was all just enjoying the landscape as part and parcel of the whole expedition, part and parcel of the whole exercise, until eventually you did get to a point where you could see Taliesin rising through the trees. And it was the most wonderful experience, because then you appreciated what all this was about. You could see, therefore, why he builds the house on the ridge of a hill. Why this was the whole reason for doing so, because that is Shining Brow, but that's the name of the house. But I mean, it is, again, you look there towards what is the living room on the right, and then the bedroom wing on the left. So the house has been changed, but changed imperceptibly through the 3 stages of its development up to this stage now. And today it's run by the Frank Lloyd Trust, and it is very, very magnificently managed. And we had a very, very bossy guide. If you stepped 1 foot out of line, you were given 100 words. But anyway, it was well worth the expedition. It was fantastic. Now, if you approached it, if you approached it from the land, that would be it. Here, if you approach it from the roadside, you would then see the house, as it were, sheltering on the ridge of the land. What you see only is just the roof lines, you see. and then it will emerge later. But it is so much part and parcel of the whole integration of the building of man integrating with nature. That's the whole point of the reason why he builds this and why his houses, his prairie houses, were so much part and parcel of his spirit for the integration of house and man and nature. And there you can see it today. Now, again, where is the entrance? It's not this room there. That's a figure. That's a Chinese ornament or Oriental ornament. That's just a big stained glass window. The doorway actually is right in the corner there, the entrance. And then again, when these fires take place, the first tragic disaster, cataclysmic disaster, and then the second fire from an electrical fault, when they both take place, they only burn what is the residence. They don't burn the outbuildings. The outbuildings, well, I call them outbuildings. I mean, they're offices and studios and they're then guest bedrooms and all sorts of things as well. But those were never destroyed to any large extent. Now, the house, as you enter it, there is to first of all enter. The rooms are big, and again the ceiling beams reflect the shape of the roofs themselves. Never, of course, ever having attics in a house. And here you can see the big reception area, also studio come reception area, where guests and clients would be entertained. And what is interesting here is you can see on the walls the Japanese screen there and Japanese woodcuts below, because he was a great expert and a very, very knowledgeable man and very fascinated and passionately interested in Japanese art. And so Taliesin was a great showplace for that. From the studio, this is also in the same room, looking the other way. That is Frank Lloyd Wright's mother above the fireplace. And then you look down to a little corridor that leads you into what has been called one of the most uplifting or magnificent living rooms in the world. This huge, huge space, the light-filled windows with their horizontal bands, and in the corner, quite definitely, are pianos and musical instruments, because this was used for concerts, this was used for entertainment, this was used for visiting guests when they would have these concerts in the evening when Frank Lloyd Wright and others would perform, and then occasionally you would have professionals as well. And again, looking back from there to the entrance where we came from, that's the corridor leading to the studio. The dining table, always fixed, with the spindle-back chairs, always fairly insignificant dining tables, subsidiary to the living area. And then from the living room, you look out through this window there. This just sort of gives you an idea of the landscape beyond, the lake and the rolling hills, the trees. This is called the bird walk because you're meant to be able to walk down it to then get as close as possible to see the birds in the trees. This was built for his third wife, who we'll discuss tomorrow. And there we can, as I say, see the rolling landscape, see the natural environment within which man's contribution should align and should be adaptable to the natural environment of the contours of the land. And then the bedrooms are always very insignificant. They're just little sort of cubby holes almost. But in the bedroom suite of Frank Lloyd Wright, you have this large room. And it's just to tie up what's gone before, because the cataclysmic disaster of the murder of Mamah and her two children must have been earth-shattering for everybody, let alone Frank Lloyd Wright. But he writes about the fact that he received sackfuls of mail, sackfuls, most of which he didn't even bother to open. He doesn't even bother to even open the sack sometimes. He was just so distraught and so upset to begin with. And unfortunately, tragically, on one day he thought, well, he better sift through a few of these, and he came across a rather bulky letter, definitely written in a woman's handwriting, he was attracted by the handwriting, or attracted by perhaps the perfume that emanated from the perfumed paper. Whatever. I think, he was desperate anyway. Whatever, he opened this letter. It was a very understanding, very loving, very caring letter from a woman he didn't know. They arranged to meet, and her name was Miriam Noel, and they have an affair. He finds her very, very attractive, but unfortunately he didn't realize, why could he, why should he, that she was a psychopathic creature. She was also a drug addict. She was a heroin taker. And she led him the most terrifying, dramatic life thereafter. It was sort of a decade of agony for him. And eventually he will only receive a divorce from his first wife in 1922. He waits for a year. He has the court's demand he waits for a year before he marries Miriam. And in his autobiography, he writes that, "I thought things would get better after the marriage, and they only got worse." And of course, now she had him. Now she could do what she liked, and now she screamed more and more, and she took more and more pills, and she just became an absolute menace, a terrifying figure in his life. So it was a very, very tragic disaster. Affected naturally, it was a sort of he was on the rebound when he met her, and this made his life unbearable. But what I think saved